Hey everyone, welcome to another episode from AMPro Engineering. In this episode, we are going to talk about a rather modern car by my standards, the Tamiya Rising Fighter. Now, the first thing I want to mention is that this is not technically how a Rising Fighter looks. On top of that, it clearly states that it is not a Rising Fighter, but rest assured, this was my own creation. But the fact that I called it the Hornet 3 is actually not that far off from what it really is. What we are looking at here is a relatively new model that Tamiya has produced. However, it really calls back to the days of the Grasshopper and the Hornet in a few ways. First off, it is an incredibly simple build with a main chassis that supports the front arms, as well as a transmission of the rolling rigid type, which basically means that the transmission can articulate, which is very helpful if you have a Grasshopper to compare this to, where basically the only kind of articulation is the front suspension compression when you are going over some kind of a rough surface. In the case of the Rising Fighter, the rear end will actually articulate while keeping the front tires on the ground. Like the Grasshopper and the Hornet, this car does suffer from some peculiar rear suspension characteristics. For example, under acceleration, the rotation of the motor does pull the suspension downward, and that force does pull the transmission down and kind of make the car, try that again here, make the rear end kind of perk itself up, and the result of this means the car has no rear suspension under acceleration. This car has been modified somewhat by me. A couple of things that I have done were the front double wishbone suspension, so the car does now have an upgraded front suspension where it doesn't really have the camber gain like it would have originally. What I did want to point out though is that this car very easily accepts upgraded front oil-filled shocks. The kit Rising Fighter does not have oil-filled shocks. They are friction shocks. However, they're blue color, so it kind of has a unique look amongst Tamiya buggies. Not many had blue friction shocks. The installation of these simply requires you to buy a set of front shock absorbers for a Super Hornet or those off of a Stadium Blitzer. At the rear, there is some changes too. First off, we do have oil-fill shocks off of a Stadium Blitzer, but the standard mounting position of the shock absorber is actually this point right here. And for me, it gave the car a very peculiar stance. From the side, and I've got some pictures up right now, the car sat roundabout like that, and it was very, very odd to say the least. I did create this rear brace, which lowered the rear suspension and gave the car a bit of a sleeker appearance. But again, these things that I'm showing you right now are not necessary for the Rising Fighter to be a fun car. So for the remainder of this, I do want to focus on the standard Rising Fighter. First things first, the cosmetics. The Rising Fighter is molded in blue. This is a box art body. The body bears a striking resemblance to the Super Hornet because it is basically a Super Hornet. These shock arches here have been cut down a little bit for the Rising Fighter, as it does have an additional brace right here that the Super Hornet and the Grasshopper 2 do not have, so it needed that to clear this new piece. Unlike the Super Hornet, it does have a separate wing, and also unlike the Super Hornet and the Grasshopper 2, this body is screwed to the chassis. Very similar to how the original Grasshopper had the body screwed to the chassis. In terms of the cosmetics of the car, I happen to really like the Rising Fighter's look. It has a modern appeal, having kind of these almost tribal-esque flames with the chrome details. I think it's actually a very, very attractive body, and that kind of follows through on the wing. And what I wanted to mention too is that this car came used. I bought this thing for next to nothing because it was a rather battered example. But regardless of how beat up this car was, this body does not look half bad. You know, there's some scratches and chips and dings on this area here and on the wing, but overall, this is far from trashed. It is still very usable. Unlike the Grasshopper 2 and the Super Hornet, the Rising Fighter does have its own transmission. This is actually from the Mad Fighter, which mounts the motor in a significantly lower orientation here versus here on the original transmission on the Super Hornet. And this does help a little bit with the center of gravity. The transmission is a little bit more complicated than the original one on the Hornet, but it is still a rather simple unit, if a little cumbersome to assemble versus the original unit here. It does have a spline output where a hex drive will slide onto it. This means you can mount practically any hex drive rear wheel, and at the front, as long as the front wheel will accept a 5x11 bearing, you're all set to go. This is the chassis of the Rising Fighter, and if you've ever seen a Super Hornet or a Grasshopper 2, you'll see that it is the exact same unit. There is an additional piece that goes right here, which is where the antenna and the wing mount to, but otherwise it is basically the same chassis. One of the weak points, just like the Grasshopper and the Hornet, these seem to all break in this area here. However, when compared to the original style chassis on the Grasshopper or Hornet, you'll see that they are effectively twins of each other, just slightly modernized and enlarged for the Rising Fighter. One major change is that the battery door is held on with a couple of pins, and this is brilliant because this prevents the battery from falling out as you're driving, as so commonly happened with the Hornet and the Grasshopper. You can see here that I did add one additional piece, and if you are interested in a Rising Fighter, this is about the only upgrade I would recommend other than ball bearings. This is a retainer for the transmission, which helps to provide the car with a little bit better of a ride height, as well as bracing the transmission. And the reason why I bring up ride height is that usually these sliders here are Rising Fighter specific, and the problem is without this retainer, under very heavy loads with my new transmission brace, it's very possible that these can rub the ground. So I don't want to change these in favor of the Super Hornet like many do. I simply created a brace that will allow proper ground clearance as well as transmission articulation without any compromise whatsoever. So that's an interesting little piece there. Some of you keen observers may have noted that the transmission on this particular model is clear. I did mention that this transmission is the same one that came from the Mad Fighter, and to my recollection, the Mad Fighter also had this smoked clear transmission. I don't know if that's the case with all of them. However, I did pick this transmission up just to kind of spruce it up a little bit. You will also note that the Rising Fighter body does not have the headlights, which is, I think, quite a shame, as that was part of the charm of the original, the Hornet and the Grasshopper. On this side here, you can see that the mold had been altered and plugged right there. I see a little bit better right here, so that the body no longer has that hole. As for wheels and tires, you'll be getting some front ribs like these, as well as these rear tires. However, the rims that come with the kit are these units here. As I mentioned before, these are 12mm hex at the rear and standard 5x11 bushings at the front. I'm really not a fan of this design. I know Tamiya uses these on a few cars, and I've seen them on other cars that I think look fine, but the Rising Fighter, I thought these looked a little too modern. This car needed more of a retro look, so what I did is I pulled the front rims off of a Wild One, and then 3D printed my own variation of that front Wild One wheel for the rear. The Wild One does not have the proper offset, nor does it have the proper mounting. However, as I mentioned, really any hex drive rear wheel is going to work. I think now is a good time to take this car for a spin.
Sorry, Mark.
As I'm sure you've heard me say before, I do drive my cars quite often. I find it a very nice way to relax after a stressful day, and it's always nice to go on a walk with the family and a toy car. This car is very playful. It always gives the feeling that it wants to go out and jump off curves and have a good time. And early on, when I first saw the Rising Fighter, I have to say that I didn't like it. In fact, I thought it was kind of terrible. And I didn't realize it until later that someone actually had pointed out that this was a Super Hornet body. And suddenly, that completely changed my viewpoint of this car. I kind of thought to myself, you're kidding. It's a Super Hornet? So I got the car and I promptly felt that, no, it's not a Rising Fighter. This is a Hornet 3 or a Super Duper Hornet or a Grasshopper 3. Not a Rising Fighter. To me, this is a car that completely missed the mark when it came to the naming convention. Tamiya had an opportunity to cash in on tens of thousands of sales from people who love cars like the Grasshopper and the Hornet and have no business or desire looking at a car called a Rising Fighter. I, however, have fallen for the car and now really hope that this car also gets its cult following. That brings up the question, of course, and that is, do you want one? And again, I like to focus on the collectors and those who want to play with the car. For a collector, I find it highly unlikely that an old school Tamiya collector is going to look twice at this car, unless, like me, they are obsessed with cars like the Hornet and the Grasshopper. In the event that you do love the Hornet and the Grasshopper, these can be had very, very cheaply right now, new in box, to add to your collection. However, if you are into the early Tamiya kits, this probably doesn't have the charm that the Grasshopper and the Hornet do, simply because it is a more modern car with a more modern paint scheme, and for me, the lack of the headlights is a complete miss. Tamiya should have left those on there because they are one of those things that give Tamiya cars, especially entry-level Tamiya cars, the charm that only an entry-level Tamiya car can have. Those of you out there who want to buy a nice low-budget basher, this is probably not a bad idea. Again, you are going to be able to get much better for not much more outlay. Cars like the DT03 are significantly better at handling the rough stuff than one of these cars. However, like a Grasshopper and like an actual cockroach, this is the kind of car that will withstand a nuclear blast. The standard arms are pretty much made of bubblegum. They're so flexible. The gears on this transmission are just monumentally huge. The standard kit friction shocks are never going to need any kind of maintenance. The body simply reinforces the entire chassis. So what you're going to get here is a car that can be jumped off of the 5th story of a random office block, bounce off a parked car, and keep going. I really do believe that what we're looking here, and this is kind of sad for me to say, but this is probably the last incarnation of the historic solid axle Tamiya cars. We're talking about a car whose life started with the Grasshopper in the early 80s and very sadly has probably come to an end with the Rising Fighter. So if you are really into cars that can make you laugh, cars that are hilarious to drive, fun to drive, indestructible, and are just as out of place on asphalt as they are a racetrack, as they are a beach, then the Rising Fighter is probably the car for you. Supplies seem to have been dwindling of these cars on eBay, as well as other model early Tamiya 104 BK speed controls, maybe the 105 BKs. These, to my knowledge, never came with an MSC. If you are looking to further upgrade the car, the next good upgrade is going to be oil-filled shocks. It's going to make a massive difference. Here in the video, you can see the difference between an oil-filled shock as well and the original shocks. This car, as you can tell, has been heavily upgraded by me, and again, I do want to stress that you don't need any of the things I've done to this car. The car, as it sits, is fine. It's a good car, it's robust, but if you are a crazy person like me, I do offer the complete double wishbone front suspension kit, as well as the rear suspension kit, and the transmission brace for this car. I also have little mounts that will help you to properly install these lights. You can see them right there, so that you can properly mount the lights and make the car look like the Super Hornet, which it really always should have looked like. I began disliking the Rising Fighter and thinking it was a dumb car, to realizing that what we're looking here is the end of an era. The end of the incredibly basic yet monumentally brilliant solid axle Tamiya dune buggy. If you love the Grasshopper or the Hornet, you need to look at the Rising Fighter. And with that, everybody, thank you all so much for watching this video. I was very excited to make this particular one because the Rising Fighter did go through quite the evolution for me, and the final result of what I have created really is a car that I enjoy. And whether you like your Rising Fighter stock or Hornet 3, Super Duper Hornet, or Grasshopper 3, it doesn't really matter. The inherent car is wonderful. Please subscribe if you liked my content, and before you take off, please check out the band Blue Pinto. They allow me to use their music in my videos, and a new album of theirs is coming out very soon, so I'm excited about that, to expand my audio repertoire. Thank you all so much. We'll see you next time.